A week ago on Daf Zayin, we learned about Yeshiva and Yoshev is Kazar, the fact that one isn't permitted to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. A Kohen is not permitted to serve in a seated position, he must be standing. And this really is a continuation of that piece, although it's a standalone as each of them are. Ready to serve, לעמד לשרת, and ZEVACHIM Daf Gimel Amud Beis, where readiness to serve is not only a requirement of Kehunah in terms of how he needs to be, but it's part of the very essence of Kehunah, is the readiness to serve. Based on two psukim. The first is Ki vo bachar Hashem Elokecha mikol shevatecha la'amod l'sharet b'shem Hashem hu avanav kol hayamim. Hashem has chosen the Kohen out of all the tribes to stand in service in the name of Hashem, he and his sons forever. And then a couple of psukim further on, talking about the Levim, v'sheret b'shem Hashem Elokim kechol echav ha-Levim, ha'omdim sham lifnei Hashem. They shall serve in the name of Hashem, like all the other Levim who are standing there before Hashem. Says the Gemara, Yoshev minalan, where do we learn from that you're not allowed to sit during the avodah, that the Kohen has to serve standing, not seated? Omar Rava bar Nachman, Omar Kra la'amod l'sharet. It's from that first posuk. It says that the Kohanim have to stand in service. La'amida becharti v'lo liyeshiva. I chose him. It says kivo bachar. I chose him la'amod l'sharet, to stand and serve. How much clearer does it need to be than that? Then the Gemara brings a brisa. Tanu Rabban la'amod l'sharet mitzvah. This that it says to serve would be a mitzvah, that's the right thing to do. Keshu omer ha'omdim, but when about the Levim, it says afterwards, ha'omdim, that the Levim have to be standing, shina alav hakatuv, the Torah is telling us a second time that there has to be amidah, to teach us not only is it a mitzvah, but la'akev, it actually is something that gets in the way. If he wasn't standing, the avodah is mechulal, avodah isn't any good. Omale Rava Rav Nachman. So Rava says to Rav Nachman, the first piece was Rava quoting Rav Nachman. Then we have the brisa. Then Rava says to Rav Nachman, Michti, let me try and understand this. Yoshev kezar dami umachil avodah. It seems from what you've taught us that a person sitting is like a zar, like a non-Kohen. You're saying, I've chosen him to stand. If he's not standing, he's not performing Kehunah. And machil avodah, we learn from the brisa that he actually damages the avodah if he's sitting down. In that case, he's a real zar, he's a real outside, he's not a Kohen. Ema mazar b'mita af yoshev b'mita. Then he should also be chayiv misa. He should be just as if a zar performs in an avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, the zar being a non-Kohen, just as if a non-Kohen performs a temple service, he's guilty of death, so the same should apply to somebody who does it in a seated position. Why do we learn, therefore, that an arel, an onan, and a yoshev are not b'misa, they are a ba'azhora, there's no death sentence for them? The Gemara goes on to work that out, but we're concerned with the piece that we've quoted here. So one has to try and understand what Rav Nachman is teaching us. Rav Nachman says, la'amod l'sharet, the verse that says, I've chosen him to stand in service, la'amida bechartiv v'lo liyeshiva. I've chosen him for standing, not for sitting. Is he telling us that that's what I want him to do? Is he telling us that that's an absolute requirement? Rashi is very powerful. Rashi says, "V'kivan delo nivchuru." If I didn't choose you to serve, then havaluzorim, then you're unchosen. If you're unchosen, you have the din of a zar. Even though genetically you're a Kohen, essentially you're a zar. V'zar machil avoda, and a zar is mechalel avoda. He damages. He disqualifies the avoda. That the service is not a qualified service. So you can learn, according to Rashi, Rav Nachman learns the whole thing, even the consequence of serving while seated, which is disqualifying the service, is all learned from the first posuk of La'amod l'sharet. So then what does the brisa come to teach? So you've got to say it's two different views. You've got Rav Nachman who's learning it all from La'amod l'sharet, And the Brisa says, no, it's not because you're a zar. The Brisa says there are two psukim. We learn it from two psukim. It says לעמד לשרת, and it says העומדים שם לפני Hashem. And from the two psukim, we learn that there's a gzeras hakosov, there's a law of the Torah that you're not allowed to sit, and if you sat there, avodah is mechalal. That's how a lot of the Acharonim understand the Rashi, that you've got to say that these are two different limudim. Tosfos explains it in a similar way. From the words of לעמוד לשרת, one who is sitting is considered like a Yisrael zar, lekach bechalel avodah kazar, and therefore he damages the avodah like a zar. Very, very difficult. Part of the difficulty is the flow of the Gemara. Surely then, Rava should have asked his question immediately. Rava says in the name of Rav Nachman, לעמוד לשרת לעמידה בחרתי ולא לישיבה. I've chosen you to stand, not to sit. Surely on that he should immediately say, if that means the way Rashi learns it, if that means you've got to stand, and if you don't stand, the avodah is disqualified. On that, Rava should ask Rav Nachman. So then why doesn't he get the death sentence? Why does the Brisa get inserted in between? Furthermore, there's a Rambam. The Rambam says, V'chol ha'oved v'hu yoshev, if a person is serving in a seated position, chilel v'avodato psula, he's caused disqualification of the korban, v'avodato psula, and the avodah is possible, the avodah is not counted, the service is not counted. It's disqualified. Why? Mipnei she'azhara shelo michlal asehi. Sorry, Abatz adds the Rambam, he doesn't get Malchus. Why doesn't he get Malchus? Because this is alava ba michlal aseh, which has the din of an aseh. That means it's implied from a positive act. It doesn't say thou shalt not. It says thou shalt, and from the thou shalt, you learn the thou shalt not. Which means in essence, it's not a negative mitzvah. It's not something you shouldn't do. It's something you should do in a certain way and not in other ways. So here it says in the pasuk, la'amod l'sharet, I chose him to stand in service. You learn from that you're not allowed to be seated. Says the Rambam, that's a lava ba michlal aseh, you're deducing a negative from a positive, and there's no malchus, you don't get lashes for that in that particular case. Asks Rabbi David Soloveitchik, in the case of mechusa begodim, when we've talked before about a kohen who serves without his clothes, his proper kohen clothes on, there he's not considered like a kohen, and the Rambam actually says that. Whereas in our case, the Rambam doesn't mention that he's like a zar. If the whole thing is being learned from Rav Nachman's whole chidush is that if you're seated, you're a zar. If you're seated, you're not a kohen. The Rambam should say that the same as he does by mechusa begodim. If you're not clothed properly, you're not a kohen. If you're not seated, if you're seated, you're not a kohen. The Rambam doesn't say that. So is the Rambam, if we regard these as two different views, Rav Nachman on the one hand and the Brisa on the other hand, why Rav Nachman has the right to disagree with the Brisa is a different discussion. But if these are two views, then who's the Rambam going like? If the Rambam is going like Rav Nachman, the essence of Rav Nachman is you're a zar, and a zar is not allowed to serve, and he leaves it as a question. But I want to understand the Gemara a little bit differently based on a run in Sanhedrin, and the way we'll understand the Gemara will resolve a lot of things. The same limud appears in Sanhedrin Daf Pei Daled, and there the Ran says, this does not mean that because he hasn't been chosen, he's not a kohen. So he says, Rashi has a different approach. It says the Ran. But I'm not going Rashi's way. Says the Ran, this does not mean that because I'm seated, I'm not a kohen. What it means is something different. This is not like Rashi and Tosfos, that I didn't choose you and therefore you're a zar, you're an ordinary Jew, you're not a kohen. You're not nivchar, you're not of a choice. A little kid was trying to sell me arovis in the market last night, and he said that it's AAA. It's min hamuvchar. This is not AAA. If you're standing, says the Ran, what this pasuk teaches you, it's not AAA. If you're standing and you're teaching the and you're doing an avodah in a seated place, that's what Rav Nachman says. Bearing that Ran in mind, let's learn the sugya a little bit differently and understand the Rambam much better. That means Rav Nachman comes along and he teaches לעמד לשרת לעמידה בחרטיב ולא לישיבה. What does Rav Nachman mean? In other words, or more importantly, what does the posuk mean? Does the posuk mean what the Ran is suggesting? That it's not AAA? Or does the posuk mean Yurazar, like Rashi learns? It's not clear from the posuk, and it's not even clear from Rav Nachman. Says Rova, but once I learn the Brisa, the Brisa teaches me what the first posuk means. It's not that the Brisa is a second view. The Brisa comes along and says, לעמד לשרת mitzvah. If it only said לעמד לשרת, I would say because sitting is not AAA, and the right way to do it is standing. But since Shina Katuv, the posuk comes and tells us again, Haomdim Sham Lifnei Hashem, that teaches me that when the first posuk said לעמד לשרת, it's mechalel. It teaches me that this is essential to the Kohen. It's not a nice to have. It's not the right way to do it. It's what a Kohen is. A Kohen is omed l'shores. This is definition of Kehunah. Kehunah is not just a genetic element of descent, that my father was a Kohen, so I'm a Kohen. That's one piece of it. Your father was a Kohen, so you have the right to be a Kohen. But being a Kohen means omed l'shores. That's what a Kohen does. A Kohen is omed l'shores. That's what the Pasuk says, Kivo v'achar Hashem Elokecha mikol shvatecha la'amod l'sharet. And that's what Rashi means, that once I have the limud, once I understand the Pasuk the way we have it at the end of the sugya, it means absolutely this is the definition of Kehunah. And what does a zar mean? A zar doesn't mean you were made a zar. Hashem pointed at me. I'm not a Kohen, I'm not a Levi. Did Hashem point at me and say, you're just a zar? No, you're a Jew. From the reservoir of Yisraelim, I've chosen certain people as Kohanim. Those who I haven't chosen are Zorim. Says Rashi, therefore, by definition, if you weren't chosen, you're a zar. It's not that I'm saying you made a zar because you... No, by definition, if you weren't chosen. And the chosenness has two elements. You have to qualify to be a Kohen. That means your father must be a Kohen. And you have to have the attitude of Kohen. Because that's what Kehunah means. It means la'amod l'sharet. Have you ever walked into a store or into a restaurant and noticed the servers are not omdim l'sharet? They're not ready to serve. They're on their phones, they're talking to one another, they're moving in slow motion. And you'll go into another restaurant and you'll find it buzzing. I was in New York, there was a kosher restaurant, Italian restaurant, that was buzzing. The food was coming out so fast, it was packed, there was a line down the road, you can't imagine. Next door, there was a top-class Italian restaurant, not kosher, empty. Nobody there. I was there a second time on the visit, same thing. The kosher one was packed, the other one was not, because the one was kosher and the other one wasn't. There were non-kosher people, there were goyim in the kosher one. And I tried to understand the difference, and I saw the difference. Oimdim l'shores. You walked into the first one, into the kosher one, and you felt the people are there to serve. They're there to make the best pizza they can and pasta, and they're there. That's what they're there to do. They're oimdim l'shores. That's what a kohen is meant to be. Oimed l'shores. And that you know you're going to get a good experience. When you walk in their shlepish, and they're not oimdim l'shores, you know it's not going to be a good experience. You know exactly what it means. There's stores like that here in Ra'anana. You know what I mean. You walk in there, you know you're going to have a bad experience. And there are others where you go and it's oimdim l'shores. A kohen is oimed l'shores. We said a week ago on Daf Yomi, oimed is ready to serve. Yoshev is being served. And the idea of a kohen is to be ready to serve. And so now we understand when the Rambam says, the Rambam learns it all from Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman is telling you what the posuk means. And Rav is expanding it and explaining Rav Nachman based on the Brisa. What the posuk means, oimdim l'shores, means that without that you're not a kohen. You're not in the state of mind of a kohen. The source is the posuk. But it's not because there's a technical deficiency, like in the case of mechusar begadim, where you don't have the right clothes. There's a technical problem. This is not technical, this is attitudinal. And the chidush here is a kohen needs attitude as well. A kohen doesn't only need to be descended and dressed. Yes, he needs to be dressed. We spoke about that in detail. And he needs to have the right jeans. I don't mean trousers, I mean inside the jeans. And he needs to have the right attitude. That's a kohen. That's what service is. We learn from here what service is. We could have a whole workshop on service that comes closer to your area of work. What's interesting is tonight, in Yirtzeh Hashem, we're going to do a mitzvah of leishev b'sukkah. Why is it not la'amod b'sukkah? If we do our mitzvah standing, we're going to do lulav and esrog tomorrow, we stand. Put on your tefillin, you stand. But whenever we do a mitzvah, we stand. Why are we sitting in the sukkah? Why leishev b'sukkah? Because the Kohanim, the one thing the Kohanim, according to most, are allowed to do with the korban is eat it seated. When you're eating, you sit. Why? Because when you're eating, you're not omed l'shoris. When you're eating, you are receiving. And the Kohanim b'shulchan gavoa kazachi, when Kohanim are eating, they are being served kibiyachol by Hashem. Hashem is standing and giving them their food. That's what it is to be eating kodshim. And it's exactly the same with us. We've got to learn from that with our eating as well. That we say, Hazanet ha'olam kulo b'tavo. The Rebbeinu Shem is giving us our food. When you sit down at a meal, you should feel not only that you're sitting at a mizbeach, that the table is a mizbeach, but if the table is a mizbeach, you're a kohen. But you're not a kohen who's omed l'shores. You're a kohen who's eating kodshim. Umishulchan gavoa kazachi. The Rebbeinu Shem is inviting you to his table. Your table is God's table. And who's serving you? Hashem is serving you. What an unbelievable concept every time you sit down to a meal. That's why you've got to eat a meal sitting down, because it's not omed l'shores. Where are you going? Where are you running? Why are you looking at yourself? And imagine you were sitting down in Hashem's palace, and Hashem, like Avrom Avinu v'hu omed alehem, and he stood there and served them. Imagine the Rebbeinu Shalom standing there serving your food. How would you eat your meal? What would the conversation be at your table? What would your inner state of being be if you saw Hashem serving you? That's what sitting at a meal is. And at Sukkot, we're sitting, the mitzvah is to eat. If the mitzvah is to eat, it has to be yeshiva. So much so, Rav Horowitz gave a shir on Shabbos about the shita of the Rambam, that you've got to stand for Kiddush, even if you normally sit, or you've got to stand for Kiddush according to the Rambam on Sukkot, so that you can say Leishev Basukah and then sit down. Because the mitzvah is to sit. The mitzvah is not just to eat. The Ramor holds the mitzvah is to eat, and as long as you say the bracha before you eat, it's good. The Rambam holds the mitzvah is to sit. That's the whole mitzvah, to sit. You're sitting there, and the Rebbeinu Shem is standing there, v'hu omed, and he's standing there ready to serve you. For that you're seated. So the mitzvah tonight is to sit in the sukkah and to understand you're sitting at the Rebbeinu Shem's table. And whether you stand for Kiddush or you sit is a different discussion, but for the eating, you definitely are seated. And you're seated as a b'shulchan gavoa kazachi. We are receiving from the Rebbeinu Shalom, sitting at his table, enjoying his presence, enjoying being in his presence in the sukkah, and we should all have a wonderful Yom Tov this evening.